Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. As people start trickling in, I'd love to familiarize you with the system. So in your screen, you should see a little kind of comments box with a little question mark. That is where you can write your questions. We'll be taking questions throughout the event today and also have some time at the end as well. You can go ahead and test that out now if you would like. Just say hello to make sure that your chats are coming in. My colleague Megan McGonigal will be here answering your questions as we go through today's webinar. So please be sure to use that comment/questions box. And I see some hellos coming in. Good morning. Okay, so again, if you're just joining us, please use that little questions/comments box. It's like a little comments icon with a little question mark inside. That's where you can write your questions throughout our webinar today. Okay. So we'll begin shortly. Okay, so welcome everyone to our webinar. Today we're going to be talking about boosting your listening skills for the DLPT or any other listening test that you may have. We're going to be talking about some really neat strategies for you. I'm Priscilla Colon, the School and Faculty Engagement Manager for Transparent Language. I'm a former language teacher and project manager in educational publishing. I'm currently working as a customer trainer and advocate. I love testing new technology and bringing you some of these professional development webinars that will help you as we learn information. We can share it along with you, to you as well. So for our agenda today, we're going to be talking about listening. So why is listening difficult? All of those difficulties that you may encounter as a language learner. We're going to be talking about our strategies to become a better listener. We have a few of those available to you. We're also going to give you some test-taking tips and talk about some amazing new CL150 resources that are coming up brand new in 2023, which we're really excited to share. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions as we go through our webinar today, please write them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer them for you. We'll also have time at the end. And if we can't have a response for you today, we will take your questions and answer them via email. So let's start with our first topic, which is why is listening so difficult? So as a language learner, if you're having difficulty with listening, you are not alone. I heard a beautiful quote that said, listening is not just reading with your ears. It's very tough for everyone. And statistics show that language learners tend to score higher in reading than on listening tests for a variety of reasons. So the first one is that when you're listening, you're hearing various accents and voices. So the pace at which natural speech goes, it's much faster. And you know yourself that when you encounter regional accents and fast rate of speech, it's difficult for you, even in your own native language. People may also do things like mumble. They may have different pitches. And on top of that, there are no visual cues for you when you're listening. For example, when you read, there's spaces between words and sentences. You don't have those when you're listening in language. So you don't know where a word or a sentence ends or begins. The other problem is that there's no way to pause or rewind in real time. So if you miss a word, for example, you spend a couple of seconds trying to figure out what the person said, but by that time the conversation has moved on and now you're totally lost. So there's a trickle down effect when you have difficulties listening. And this is hard for everyone, not just at the lower levels, it's at the higher levels as well. So I'd love to show you a visual of what listening might look like. Imagine that you are watching the news and you see this. It's like a ticker tape going at the bottom with all of the words smushed together, and you have no idea where the words break or the sentences break. And so this is what listening is like in real time. Now, let's imagine that there's a difference in accent or pitch. Somebody's words may look like that, which is much more difficult as well. So this is what listening is like, and it is very difficult for everyone, as I said. There are also other things that happen naturally in language, things like filler words. Well, you know, and that's distracting as a new language learner. You also have reduced forms of words that you wouldn't see in writing. So I'm gonna, shoulda, woulda, coulda. You say those naturally. And so you're gonna find that in every language as well. There may be false starts or self-corrections where somebody will begin speaking and say, never mind, hold on, let me go back. And that right there is even more confusing if you're not a native speaker of the language. And of course, there's also people talking over each other, background noise, etc. So what is the solution? How can we become a better listener? Well, the bad news is that there are no shortcuts. So the obvious answer is that you have to practice listening a lot. And we're going to be talking about what that means. It's about increasing the quantity and quality of your listening. We're going to give you some examples today. Another thing that you need to do is build your listening vocabulary. Now, as I mentioned, the vocabulary that you hear when you're listening is very different from the forms that you may see in writing. So we're going to be talking about how to build your vocabulary and what kinds of vocabulary to build at each level. Another strategy for becoming a better listener includes varying your sources, everything from the topics, the domains, and even who you listen to. And we'll talk today about why that is important and how that's going to help prepare you for the DLPT. And one key thing that a lot of people forget is that they forget to use the supports. And we're going to talk about some of the supports that are available to you with the advent of all of this new technology. So let's break down each of these prep strategies for listening a bit more. And let's begin with becoming a better listener. So the first thing is that listening is like, let's say, lifting or working out. You have to start slow and build up. You wouldn't walk into the gym and start deadlifting 260 pounds without warming up, right? So that requires build up. So some of the things that you want to start off with, especially at the lower levels, is to begin by listening to familiar topics. The way the human brain works is that it needs to make connections with something you know. So if you're listening to familiar topics, you know it already in your native language, and now you can make those connections in your learning language. It allows you to listen to something you know and enjoy, and it creates an easy win, and you're more likely to stick to it. Other things you might want to listen to at these lower levels include instructional videos, young adult audiobooks, maybe some simple illustrated stories or children's shows. And the reasons you want to start with these topics or these types of listening passages is because, one, these are topics that are familiar to you, and the audio in these types of passages are going to be at a slower pace. They usually are for these types of audiences. It's going to help you make those associations with what you know, which is going to be very key. So I'll give you an example. Even in your own native language, if you look up an instructional video on how to build a wine rack, for example, you need to know some basic knowledge of hand tools, carpentry in your native language, or else that topic is not going to make any sense to you. So the same thing applies when you are working with your learning language. Start with familiar topics and types of passages or audio sections that are going to be at a slower speed for you. And also be an active listener. So what does that mean? It means that you are taking the time to ask yourself if you really understood what was being said, and you can pause and rewind. Don't be afraid of using those supports. No one is judging you. You are prepping for the test, or you are just acquiring your skills. So make sure that you are actively listening. You're not going to be able to learn through osmosis. Okay, so any questions up to this point, whether it's about the types of passages or audio portions that you should be listening to, or about active listening practices?
No questions yet, Priscilla. I'll let you know if anything comes in.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to move up a level, right? So after this is when you would want to tackle things such as daily situations, information about traffic, food, weather, even accommodations. All of these have to do with factual information. So they include the types of vocabulary and situations that you would encounter in your everyday life. So from the passages for younger viewers, now you're more into what's happening in your everyday life, things that you can talk about, and they're still very familiar topics for you. Once you feel comfortable with this, then we're going to be moving on to the news. Most of you may ask, well, on the DLPT, I'm going to find a lot of news reports. Why don't we start with that? Well, there are a few reasons for that. Even though news reports focus on factual information, a lot of it tends to be at a much faster rate of speed. So it's going to be more difficult if you don't have some foundational knowledge. Things like news reports that deal with current events, even some very short interviews, are going to be a little bit faster. Especially with news, topics may change every 10 to 20 seconds, so it can be a little jarring if you don't have some foundational listening skills. There also may not be any visual cues to help you along, and let's say the news report is about a story that started 6 months ago, you may feel a little lost if you don't know the beginning of the story, if you haven't been following it. So this is why you want to work up to news reports. And as I mentioned, you're going to see a lot of these on the DLPT, especially at the ILR 2 level. Some things that you can do easily online is that you can listen to news broadcasts, whether it's streaming services, podcasts, online videos. You can find these very easily online nowadays. And then the last one, which is interviews. At this point, we're talking about very short interviews, not huge conversations with opinions. Because these short interviews often offer redundancy, so the interviewee may repeat the question being asked before answering and so forth. So these are the types of audio passages that you might be interested in listening to when prepping at this level. So any questions on this before we move to the higher levels?
No questions yet.
Okay, great. So now that you've built a solid foundation, you are ready for some heavy lifting. So now you are ready to listen to passages that focus on opinions, things like extensive interviews, debates, round panel discussions, maybe conversations around a specific domain. These may be formal interviews, maybe on-street interviews, longer conversations, and these are the types of audio passages that you're going to find on the DLPT at the higher levels. So the ILR 3s, the 3+s. I'll give you an example of the types of conversations that you may encounter and why it's important that you work up to them. So the other day I was listening to an interview, very casual interview with a Puerto Rican farmer. And as she was speaking, she said something along the lines of, I consider myself a modern day Hibara. After Maria, I realized how important food sovereignty is for Puerto Ricans, and I decided to put my agroecology degree to good use. So in those short couple of sentences, I've provided a lot of information that include implicit cultural information, historical information, even some domain-specific vocabulary that if you don't have the vocabulary background, cultural background, it will be very difficult to understand. So I'll pull apart some of those sentences and show you. So for example, the woman called herself a modern day Hibara. You need to know culturally that the word Hibara is an indigenous term from Puerto Rico, that it was pejorative in nature for the last few hundred years, and that it's now being reclaimed by people who are returning to the indigenous ways of growing food. So that's a lot to pack into one little word. She also mentioned something like after Maria. So was she talking about a woman named Maria? No, she was talking about Hurricane Maria, which occurred in 2017 and devastated the small farms in Puerto Rico. So again, this is a lot of kind of historical information that I would have needed to know and to be following for the last few years. And then there were also some domain-specific terms such as food sovereignty and agroecology that if I'm not familiar with in my own native language, I may not understand in the language being spoken during this interview. So this is why it is important to work your way up to formal interviews because you don't want to be missing, like 90% of what's being discussed. It's not going to be fun for you. So make sure that you're working up to these interviews. Any questions about the types of conversations you might encounter at the ILR 3 level?
Not yet.
Okay, great. So now let's go to the second part of the strategy. So you've seen what types of texts you might encounter and how to begin working on them. Now let's talk about building your vocabulary. So why is vocabulary important? Number one is that without vocabulary, you're really not going to understand anything. And studies show that there's a correlation between proficiency levels and your vocabulary size. So I don't mean that you need to create larger and larger lists of flashcards. What we mean is that you need to build your vocabulary through listening. And the types of vocabulary words you will encounter and you need to build are going to be different depending on your level. So at the lower levels, you're going to be looking for those high frequency words and phrases. Hello, how are you? A pleasure to meet you. And you'll notice that even as I said them, they're going to be different than what you might encounter in writing. So it's very important that you expose yourself to a lot of vocabulary and add it to your bank of vocabulary words, especially at those lower levels. And then when you get to the higher levels, you're building vocabulary depth. Now you're getting into domain-specific vocabulary like the ones that I mentioned, agroecology, food sovereignty, etc. You're getting into the idiomatic expressions in language. That's going to be important as well. And so that's going to be incredibly helpful for you, whether you are taking a DLPT at the lower levels or at the higher levels. Vocabulary is going to be very, very important. The other thing is that vocabulary is going to help you understand, especially at the higher levels, the tone of the author, whether it's a specific opinion or perspective, which is a question that you always get asked on the DLPT. If you were part of last week's webinar, when we talked about the reading portions of the DLPT, we talked about words having a positive, negative, or neutral aspect to them so that you understand how people feel about what is being discussed. So that is incredibly important. And of course, at the lower levels, you're getting vocabulary to provide you with the facts as well. So again, building your vocabulary is going to be key for listening as well. So a second strategy that we recommend is varying your sources. And so number one is you want to use authentic sources, that is, audio that was recorded by native speakers for native speakers for a variety of reasons. Number one is you're going to hear real speech at real speeds using real world language. So for example, I recently went to Peru and I wanted to hear what Peruvian sounded like. I'm a native Spanish speaker, but I understand that Spanish varies by country and region. So in Peru, do they use the words ticket, boleto, entrada? Do they use show, programa, espectáculo? You might be surprised by what's being used in country by real people. It may be very different from what you're learning in your textbook. So it's very important to use authentic audio sources. The other thing that these authentic audio sources are going to do is that they're going to expose you to natural speech, which includes the speed at which people speak, interruptions, filler words. So do they say bueno? What do they use? Is the cadence from certain regions faster or slower? Is it sing-songy? Do words run together? So that's important to expose your ears to that. The other thing is you need exposure to many different topics. So I'll give you an example. Even in your own native language, what if you never listened to the Discovery Channel and they were talking about quasars? You had no idea what quasars are. Or there's a clip about artificial intelligence, but you'd never heard AI used in context before. Even in your own native language, that is going to be difficult for you to understand. So imagine now adding the complexity of a learning language. So make sure that you're exposing yourself to a variety of topics as you're prepping, so that, when it comes to test time, you won't be surprised. And your brain obviously will be able to make those connections with something that you already know. Another key thing, and this is a mistake a lot of people make because they get comfortable with a certain, newscast or channel or whatever that may be, is that they don't vary the voices, accents, and registers they hear. So don't listen to the same news broadcast or same person every day. Make sure that you're varying who you're listening to so that you get exposure to different voices, timbres, pitches. That's just practical, right? And especially when it comes to genders and languages with gendered grammar structures, that's going to be very important for you to understand. And also it will give you, hints about cultural norms, etc. That's just practical, right? I was watching the Selena show on Netflix. It was really funny because they were talking about how she prepared to speak to news outlets in Mexico because she didn't know Spanish. So she watched a lot of soap operas, but then her Spanish became very dramatic because that's what she was listening to in soap operas. So don't do like Selena did, vary your sources. It's going to be super useful for you as you become a better listener. Okay, so now that we know that, but what kinds of sources are we talking about? Well, nowadays you have so many sources available to you. Long gone are the days where you had to trudge over to your local library and take out a video cassette, VHS tape. You can actually just go online and get a variety of authentic sources, such as news broadcasts, podcasts, documentaries, any number of in-country video tours, even stand-up comedy. You can find that from all over the world right on your computer. And, you can use any type of streaming service, Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, etc. It's readily available. So just in prepping for this webinar today, for example, I found a TED Talk called Le Kimono Africain. It's about a speaker's childhood experiences in Cameroon, and he went later on to work in Japan, and he does a lot of cultural comparisons, and it provides exposure in this particular speaker's African French accent. There are podcasts, for example, this podcast by a local history expert who talks about some, cool places to visit while in Russia. And so you get some cultural information, some basic tourist information that would be really cool to have and important, especially at the lower levels. And one of my favorites on Netflix, I'm waiting for the second season, is Lupin, which is in French. And it provides some domain-specific vocabulary, everything from the justice system in France to issues of race and class. And it's all surrounding the world of high-end art and antiquities. And it's just like a fun detective show. And so just to say that, just because you're studying your language doesn't mean that you can't have fun. You can find tons of shows out there that are interesting and in language. So, and they'll help you build that vocabulary that you need. So this is a really good one if you are interested in fun detective shows. So one thing that many learners forget is that we really should be using supports whenever possible. So I mentioned that I went to Peru recently and I'm a native Spanish speaker, but I'm still using as many supports as possible if I'm going to Peru, which I know speaks slightly different Spanish. They have different influences. So I did things like I would watch videos on YouTube with different native speakers. And if you're doing that, you can try, for example, watching a video at full speed or the audio at full speed. You can, use the rewind and replay features. You can follow along with transcripts. So a lot of online sites such as TED Talks, YouTube have the transcripts available, or an automatic transcript can be generated. You can also enable subtitles and closed captions on any number of platforms and devices. And if all else fails, you can look it up. There may be slang terms that you hear, or maybe regional terms that you're just not familiar with, and it's okay to look it up. But if for some reason you feel completely lost with a particular audio, maybe at that point you need to just revisit the level and make sure that it's appropriate for you. So just a few tips on using supports. Yes, go ahead.
Question relevant to that last point, but maybe in the other direction. Someone wants to know, is there a good metric to know when to move up a level? So for example, if they watch a video and they understand, say, like 80% of it, is it time to move up, or should they stay with that video until they understand more of it?
Really good question. So to use an analogy, like going back to the lifting analogy, you'd probably want to, if you're at like the 80% level, you're really kind of understanding it. At that point, try moving up. There's nothing wrong with saying, let's try something a little harder. You can always say like, okay, taking some of the weights off. I couldn't that day, right? So there's nothing wrong with you trying something a little harder. And then if for some reason that doesn't work, then you can always go back and, refine your listening skills at the slightly lower level. Usually, I think they say you're supposed to be understanding anywhere between 80 and 90%. So yeah, try it out. You're not going to lose anything by trying it out. And you may be surprised that you try something at a little higher level and, you're like, yeah, I can absolutely do this. And so it's a nice win. So yeah, I don't see why not. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?
That is it for now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so one tip that I want to talk about today, you may not hear about, it's that you really shouldn't be neglecting your own English skills. So your own native skills are going to be key because, as I mentioned, the way the brain works is you're building off of what you know and you're making connections with information that already exists. However, the average American, according to US literacy statistics, so the average American reads at a 7th or 8th grade level, which means most of the content that you consume is at this level. So everything from, regular advertisements to news reports online is going to be written at a 7th or 8th grade level. I worked for a company that did a lot of search engine optimization content online, and everything we had to put out was at those levels. So what can you do? Well, you have to be deliberate about consuming higher level content in English. So you have to seek out, whether it's op-eds, sometimes like medical, if this is what you're interested, like medical research reports, things that are really at a much higher level. You really have to seek it out because it's just not going to come to you. So that's going to be important because you're creating those building blocks in your mind. This is also going to help you build domain-specific vocabulary. So you can imagine, you go to the DLPT and they're talking about, you're listening to a passage about the latest COVID vaccination protocols and how they were, it's based on RNA research rather than DNA research. What if you've never heard of RNA and DNA? So that's going to be key for you to have that domain-specific vocabulary. And again, it's just going to help you create that foundation so that when you are then listening to content in the learning language, you already have those spaces for connections in your mind. So let's move on to talking about specifically about the DLPT. So all these are prep strategies before you get to the DLPT. Now let's talk about what you can expect. And though we're talking specifically about the DLPT, many of the aspects of the DLPT do apply to other listening types of language tests. So the first thing is that you're going to find that the audio passages are in the target language, that is your learning language, and you're going to find that multiple choice comprehension questions are in English. This is done deliberately so that you can tell that you understand what is being asked of you. You're going to find multiple questions per passage. So for example, if there are 25 passages and you'd have about 60 questions if you have a couple per passage, maybe a little bit more. And at the higher levels, the passages are going to get more complex, and so will the questions. So for example, at the lower level, you may start with a 10-second audio of a PA announcement at a mall. And then at the higher levels, you're going to have much longer passages, let's say 45 seconds or so. There may be a conversation between a mother and son about household chores. Maybe there's a scene at a restaurant where someone changes their order. And then, at the longer passages, you may find that someone is expressing his or her opinions on a matter. There may be some added complexities as well, such as background noise, maybe formal and informal conversations. You may hear multiple speakers, genders, dialects, etc. So these are some of the things to expect with the passages. Now you can take notes during the test. You won't be able to bring anything in or take anything out with you after the test, but you'll get scratch paper and a writing implement so that you can take notes. You can listen to the audio passage 2 times. It's going to be important because we have some strategies for you that we'll talk about in a little bit. And you can take a look at the questions and answers before the audio plays. If you joined us last week for our reading test strategies, that is going to be key. We talked about always looking at the questions first, and you want to do the same when taking your listening test. One note about the DLPT-5C, this is the computer adaptive or aided test. this is now available based on what we've heard from test takers, and this is now available for Spanish and some other languages. This CAT test is going to start with audio at the intermediate ILR 2 level. Then, based on your responses, it will either move up in difficulty or down. So the goal is that they're trying to shorten the test so you don't have to start at the lowest level and then kind of build up. They're trying to start people in the middle and then based on answers, go up in difficulty or down in difficulty. This can be a little disconcerting for you if you're, let's say, at an ILR, you're at a lower level. It can be a little bit disconcerting when you take the test because it may start you up at a little bit more difficulty. But just for you to be aware that this is happening, it's something that is being rolled out for some of the languages, though I don't have information about all of the languages this is being applied to. You'll have to get some information on your own for that. So in preparation for this webinar, we asked test takers and also instructors what were some of the difficulties that they encountered. So for everyone, these were the main issues: accents, speed of speech, and background noise. And of course, if you apply some of the strategies that we talked about varying your sources, using authentic speech, you're going to be able to mitigate those because you're going to be ready for when you encounter these during the test. And then at the lower levels, the answer was just one: vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. That really is the key to making sure that you are able to pass this test at the lower levels. Because if you don't understand a word, you can get stuck on it and then not be able to move on. You don't understand the basic information, factual information that is being presented to you. We had one learner who talked about the fact that he couldn't remember the word to develop in his language, and it was everywhere on the test, and he just got stuck. So how do you make sure that that doesn't happen to you? Make sure that you're listening to a lot of content. If you're at the lower levels, let's say between ILR 1 plus and ILR 2, you're going to be, listening to those news reports, the weather reports, the day-to-day interactions. It's very important because those are the same high frequency words that you're going to see on the DLPT. So don't get stuck. Make sure that you're building the right vocabulary. And then at the higher levels, what tended to get students was understanding the author's mood and then drawing their own conclusions based on that information. So one of the things that a learner talked about was that they use words in the question such as, was the author's mood apathetic or nostalgic? Well, in this case, if you don't know what apathetic or nostalgic means in your own language, it's going to be difficult to then, figure out what the author's mood is or is not based on what you're listening to. So build your English, make sure that your native language is up to par, and then also make sure that you are listening to those opinion pieces, the panel discussions, conversations in language in preparation for this. So this is going to be very key at the higher levels. So now that we've talked about prepping, let's see some of the test taking tips before and during the test. So number one is study your language year round. All of these strategies that we've talked about require you to spend time in language. You can't assume that, studying the language, cramming for the test 2 weeks before is going to help you. The way that neuroscience, has explained it to us, we develop these neural pathways in our brain and it's like a little path in the woods, right? So if you're not walking that path a year later, you may not even find where that trail is. You know, plants are going to be overgrown. Um, you're going to need a machete to get through that. So the same thing happens in your brain. You're creating neural pathways, and the more you walk that path, the easier it will be for you. So study your language year round. Is you won't have to cram at the very end. It'll just be natural for you. The other thing is staying hydrated is key. I mean, I understand that this is like very basic, but sometimes we forget. So staying hydrated, getting rest, not overstudying. So it's counterproductive for you to overstudy or try to cram at the last minute. You're gonna put yourself in, anxiety inducing mode, and that is not helpful at all for your memory centers. Um, and then things like staying hydrated. So just watch your caffeine intake. A little caffeine can go a long way and can, get you revved up. Too much caffeine can make you jittery. So just watch yourself and know what's good for your own body. Um, one key thing that we found with many of our test takers is that they talked about warming up the morning of. So it's good to study year round, it's good to be in language mode, but the morning of, make sure you're doing things like watching the news in language, listening to your favorite podcasts, calling a friend and speaking in language, whatever it takes to kind of get your brain going so that it doesn't feel like you have to do a hard switch when you get to the test. And one learner actually said that he noticed that he scores a half a level lower when he goes in cold without warming up. So this is going to be very key. And another simple thing that you can do is also just find your Zen, whatever that is. So whether it's deep breathing, a meditation practice, or maybe going for a run or listening to a song that pumps you up, preferably in language, of course, make sure that you find yourself in, your own comfortable space because your memory centers are affected when you're in fight, flight, or freeze, and you're literally not able to remember. So you want to make sure that you are doing everything that's right for your body and your mind when going into this test. Now, during the test, we have some tips for you that will help you while you're taking this test and help you focus on how to listen for the correct responses. So number one is read the questions and answers before listening. Just like we talked about last week when we talked about the reading portions of the test, this is going to be key because it's going to help you listen for keywords and phrases. So you know what to pay attention to before you listen to the passage. Now, you're going to get two opportunities to listen to the passage. So the first pass will be your gisting pass. This means that you're going to try to understand the overall meaning of what is being talked about. So you're going to try to answer the questions, what is this audio about? How would I summarize this? What is the main idea? So that's your gisting pass. At this point, you can take notes, quick summary notes, or you can take notes on words you didn't understand. So write them down quickly. Usually, one of the people we talked to said that writing things down sometimes allows him to see the written form and then derive the meaning because he sees it in writing. But the goal is not to get caught up on what you don't understand, because remember, the audio is going to continue and you can't push pause. So it's about gisting, summarizing, quickly taking notes of something you don't understand. And then between the two listening passes, make sure that you reread the questions and answers. You may be able to eliminate a few distractors, and then you can refocus on the keywords or information to listen for during the second listen pass. So during the second listening pass is when you're going to focus on the details. So and you're going to use this pass to home in on responses. One cool tip that we received from a test taker is that he closes his eyes when listening. So this is interesting, and I don't know if it's supported by science, but I know that we all do this. So have you ever been driving down the road and you have to turn down the volume of the radio because you're trying to read a sign? So the same thing applies here, where your visual input is coming in and so is your audio input. So he closes his eyes to eliminate that visual input, and it helps him focus on the audio input. So try it out next time. See if that works for you. Try closing your eyes when you're listening to the passages, and that may help you focus as well without visual distractions. And then one very important tip is answer every question. Just like we talked about last week, you don't get points deducted for incorrect responses. So you only get points for the correct responses. So even if you have to make an educated guess, try to answer every question. It's going to be helpful for you. So before I move on to some CL 150 resources, do we have any questions on the test itself?
No more questions yet.
Okay, so we have some exciting new resources for you that are coming up in January 2023. So you have all of these wonderful tips that are going to help you, but sometimes you just need a guide, someone that you can put them into practice with. So we're launching in January 2023, we're launching the reading and listening refresher courses. And these are designed to prep you for your listening test, such as your DLPT at the ILR's 2, 2+, and 3 levels. These are either 2 or 4 week full-time courses. You can sign up for either or. You can complete them anywhere, and they include custom course materials for DoD linguists. So we're going to be covering your domains: politics, economy, technology, cyber, and so on. And if you're a DoD linguist, this can help you with your annual slate requirements. You may have other requirements if you're part of another organization. So this is going to be key for you to continually study the language. The other thing is our instructors are highly experienced with government language needs. Many of them are former DLI or FSI instructors. Some of them have even helped to create some of these exams. So they are highly skilled at what they do, and they can help guide you, whether it's analyzing complex tests at your texts at your level, building your comfort with reading or listening, and maybe helping you in some weak areas. They can also help guide you through audio passages with, let's say, a lot of background noise and so on. So we're excited to have these launch in January, and would love for you to have access to them. If you want to get early access, simply go to the link that we're leaving in the chat. We're also going to send you this link with the video of our session in the next 24 hours. And we'll ask you some simple questions about your language and your level, and we'll put you on our list so you'll be the first to know when these courses launch next year. So that is something that we're excited to offer for the first time. And of course, this is part 2 of our 3-part series. We touched on prepping for reading test last week, talked about listening this week, and next week we're going to be talking about boosting your speaking skills. And we have a couple of exciting guests with us, people who have not only worked in language programs, but have also administered and taken speaking tests, and they bring all of that knowledge to us. So we're really excited to be sharing that information with you next week. So are there any other questions before we close out for today's session on anything we talked about?
Looks like that's it, Priscilla.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope that I can see you next week. And check out all of our webinars on our site. You can always go back and rewatch and Have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.